Lady Evelyn Hartley stood at the edge of Lady Ashford's ballroom, her silk-gloved fingers smoothing the modest folds of her dove-gray gown. The whispers had become impossible to ignore this season, no longer concealed behind painted fans or polite smiles. At 40, she had made peace with her status as a confirmed spinster, but the sharp tongues of society's matrons still cut deep. "Such a pity," came Lady Pembroke's voice, deliberately pitched to carry across the marble floor. "Still unwed at 40. What a dreadful waste." "Oh, astonishing, isn't it?" But before we reveal how this incredible moment came to be, I have a question for you. Do you believe that destiny is written in the stars, or do we make it ourselves? Let me know in the comments below, and tell me, where in the world are you watching from today? I love reading you stories. Now, settle in, hit that subscribe button to join our family, and let me tell you the truth about what really happened. Evelyn had learned to make herself invisible at these gatherings. She kept to the periphery, where the candlelight didn't quite reach, where the music was softer and the laughter more distant. The season's opening ball was always the cruelest night. A parade of fresh-faced debutantes in their white gowns, each one a reminder of what Evelyn had never been. Beautiful, certainly not. Marriageable, not for 2 decades now. Lady Pembroke held court near the refreshment table, her diamonds catching the light as she gestured dramatically. 20 years she's been trotted out like yesterday's bread, she announced to her circle of sycophants. One must wonder why she even bothers attending anymore. It's quite pitiful, really. The words landed like stones. Evelyn felt the familiar heat rising in her cheeks, the tightness in her throat. She turned toward the terrace doors, ready to flee into the night garden where she could breathe again, when the room fell silent. The Duke of Ashford had arrived. Duke Julian Blackwood moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through water. He was younger than Evelyn by 5 years, impossibly handsome with his dark hair and those intense gray eyes that seemed to see through pretense and straight into truth. Every mother in the room thrust her daughter forward. Every debutante arranged her face into the practiced expression of demure interest they'd rehearsed before their mirrors. Evelyn pressed herself further into the shadows. She'd heard the gossip. The Duke was bored with society's offerings, dismissive of the simpering girls who giggled behind their fans and could speak of nothing but fashion and weather. He was the prize of the season, and he seemed entirely uninterested in being won. He walked past the first line of eager young women without a glance. Past Lady Pembroke's niece, who was considered this season's great beauty. Past the Ashworth twins, identical in pink silk and practiced smiles. The crowd parted before him, confused, expectant. And then he stopped, directly in front of Evelyn. Her breath caught. Surely he was reaching for something behind her, or perhaps he'd dropped a glove. But no, he was looking at her, his gray eyes steady and unfathomable. The entire ballroom held its collective breath. The Duke bowed, a gesture of perfect courtly grace. When he straightened, the corner of his mouth lifted in the faintest smile. "Lady Evelyn," he said, his voice carrying across the impossible silence. "May I have this dance?" The gasps rippled through the room like wind through wheat. Evelyn stood frozen, her mind refusing to process what was happening. This had to be some cruel joke, a wager perhaps. But his hand was extended, waiting, and his eyes held nothing but sincerity. She placed her gloved hand in his, and felt the world tilt on its axis. The orchestra began a waltz, and the Duke led her onto the floor with the confidence of a man who had never doubted himself. Evelyn's heart hammered against her ribs as his hand settled at her waist, proper but somehow intimate in a way that made her breath catch. They moved together as if they'd danced 1,000 times before, his lead confident, her follow instinctive. "They're staring," Evelyn whispered, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes fixed upon them. She could feel the weight of society's judgment, the speculation, the malice barely concealed behind painted fans. "Let them stare." His gray eyes never left her face. I find I much prefer your conversation to their giggling. Tell me, Lady Evelyn, what is it you've been reading lately? The question caught her off guard. No one at these gatherings ever asked her about books. I've just finished Mary Shelley's work, she admitted. Though I suspect admitting I read such scandalous material makes me even less marriageable than my age does. His laugh was genuine, rich with amusement. On the contrary, it makes you the only interesting woman in this room. They turned, and she caught a glimpse of Lady Pembroke's scandalized face. These young ladies twitter about nothing but bonnets and the weather. You, I suspect, have actual thoughts in that lovely head. Lovely. The words settled over her like sunshine breaking through clouds. No one had called her lovely in 20 years. When the music ended, he bowed over her hand, his lips brushing her glove in a gesture that sent whispers rippling through the crowd. Thank you for the dance, Lady Evelyn. It was the highlight of my evening. She fled to the retiring room the moment he released her, her face burning, her mind reeling. It had to be a joke, a cruel wager. Men like the Duke didn't choose women like her. The next morning, Evelyn woke to chaos in the household. Her brother's butler appeared at her bedroom door, his usually composed face flustered. My lady, there's been a delivery, rather a large one. In the entrance hall stood the most magnificent arrangement she'd ever seen. Crimson roses, dozens of them, their blooms full and fragrant, cascading from a crystal vase. The servants gathered around, whispering excitedly. Evelyn's hands trembled as she reached for the card tucked among the petals. The handwriting was bold, masculine, certain. For the lady whose spirit outshines the diamonds. Her brother appeared at her elbow, eyebrows raised. Well, the Duke is either serious, or this is the most elaborate joke in London's history. By noon, the gossip had reached fever pitch. Evelyn's modest drawing room filled with visitors, each one ostensibly there for tea but really there to interrogate her. Is it true? Did he really dance with you? What did he say? Lady Pembroke swept in with her coterie, all false smiles and sharp eyes. How very unexpected, Lady Pembroke purred, examining the roses as if they might be artificial. One does wonder if His Grace has made some sort of wager. Young men can be so peculiar in their humor. The words hit their mark. Evelyn felt the familiar shame creeping up her spine, the certainty that she was, indeed, the punchline of some elaborate joke. Of course, the Duke wasn't serious. Men like him didn't choose women like her. She was 40, plain, unremarkable. This was mockery dressed in roses and pretty words. That night, alone in her room, she let herself cry. 3 days later, Evelyn escaped to the Royal Academy, seeking refuge among the paintings where no one would whisper about her. Art had always been her sanctuary, the one place where she could lose herself in beauty and forget society's cruel judgments. She stood before Turner's latest seascape, studying the way he captured light on water, the violence and poetry of the storm. He makes chaos look like heaven, doesn't he? She turned, and her heart stopped. The Duke stood beside her, hands clasped behind his back, his gray eyes fixed on the painting. He wore a dark coat that made him look like a figure from a romantic novel, and he seemed utterly at ease, as if meeting her here was the most natural thing in the world. Your Grace, she managed, dropping a curtsy. Please don't. He gestured to the painting. I came here to escape all that bowing and scraping. Tell me what you see in this. She hesitated, then turned back to the canvas. I see truth, she said quietly. He doesn't paint what the sea should look like to please a patron. He paints what it is, terrible and magnificent and utterly indifferent to human wishes. Most people prefer their art to be pretty lies. Turner refuses to lie. When she looked at him, his expression had changed. The polite interest had shifted into something deeper, more intense. Go on, he said. The way he uses light, it's almost spiritual. As if God is breaking through the storm to remind us we're small and mortal, and yet somehow still beloved. She stopped, embarrassed. Forgive me. I'm sure that sounds absurd. It sounds, he said slowly, like the most intelligent thing anyone has said to me in months, perhaps years. He stepped closer, studying the painting with new eyes. The young ladies I'm usually introduced to can barely tell a Turner from a tablecloth. They say whatever they think I want to hear. And what do you want to hear? The truth. His gray eyes met hers. Always the truth. They moved through the gallery together, discussing each painting, and Evelyn felt something unfurling inside her chest. Something that had been locked away for so long she'd forgotten it existed. Joy. The simple joy of being heard, of being seen, of matching. Lady Evelyn. The voice cut through the gallery like a knife. Lady Hartwell swept toward them, her smile sharp with malice. How surprising to find you here. I wouldn't have thought you'd have time for galleries, what with all your social obligations. The insult was clear. Evelyn had no social obligations. She had nothing. Though I suppose, Lady Hartwell continued, when one has no engagements to attend, one must fill the hours somehow. She turned to the Duke, her voice dripping with false sympathy. Your Grace, you mustn't let Lady Evelyn monopolize your time. I'm sure you have far more important people to see. The temperature in the gallery seemed to drop. The Duke's expression went cold, arctic, his jaw tightening in a way that made Lady Hartwell's smile falter. On the contrary, Lady Hartwell, he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of aristocratic authority. Lady Evelyn's company is of rare value, something I suspect you cannot appreciate, as you clearly lack the depth to recognize it. He offered Evelyn his arm, pointedly turning his back on Lady Hartwell. Shall we continue, my lady? I believe there's a constable upstairs you'd appreciate. As they walked away, Evelyn could feel Lady Hartwell's shock radiating behind them like heat from a fire. The Duke had just defended her. Publicly. Unmistakably. You didn't have to do that, she whispered. Yes, he said firmly. I did. The invitation arrived on cream-colored paper, sealed with the Duke's crest. He requested the pleasure of Lady Evelyn's company, and her brothers, as propriety demanded, at the opera the following evening. His private box, the most visible location in the entire theater. He's making a statement, her brother said, reading the invitation over her shoulder. Everyone will see you there with him. This isn't a flirtation, Evelyn. This is a declaration. She wanted to believe it, but the voice of doubt, cultivated by 20 years of rejection, whispered that it was all too good to be true. The theater blazed with candlelight, every seat filled with London's elite. Evelyn wore her best gown, a deep blue silk that had cost her more than she should have spent, and tried to ignore the stares as she and her brother were led to the Duke's box. It hung above the main floor like a throne, impossible to miss. The Duke rose as they entered, his smile genuine and warm. Lady Evelyn, you look exquisite. He seated her in the place of honor, the chair closest to the box's edge, where everyone could see her. The opera was Mozart, beautiful and soaring, but Evelyn barely heard it. She was too aware of the eyes on her, the whispers rippling through the audience like wind through grass. During the interval, the Duke's box became a receiving line of sorts, with various lords and ladies stopping by to pay their respects. Lord Weatherby appeared, his expression skeptical, his tone mocking. Ashford, my dear fellow, I must ask, is this some new eccentricity? Are older ladies fashionable now? Should I alert my mother that she's back in vogue? The laughter that followed felt like acid on Evelyn's skin. She started to rise, to excuse herself, to flee before the humiliation became unbearable. But the Duke's hand caught hers. He stood, drawing Evelyn up with him, and deliberately placed her gloved hand on his arm. The gesture was unmistakable, proprietary, protective, proud. his gray eyes fixed on Lord Weatherby with an expression of cold contempt. "My choices," the Duke said, his voice carrying through the box and into the corridor beyond, "require no explanation, least of all to you, Weatherby. Lady Evelyn possesses more intelligence, grace, and genuine worth than every simpering debutante in this theater combined. If you cannot see that, then you're a greater fool than I took you for." The silence that followed was absolute. Lord Weatherby's face turned red, then white. He bowed stiffly and retreated. The Duke turned to Evelyn, his expression softening. "Forgive me if that was too bold," he said quietly, "but I will not stand by while anyone insults you." Evelyn's eyes burned with unshed tears. No one had ever defended her like this. No one had ever made her feel like she mattered, like she was worth fighting for. "Thank you," she whispered. His hand covered hers where it rested on his arm. "The pleasure," he said, "is entirely mine." The invitation to his country estate arrived a week later. He wanted to call on her, at her home, away from London's prying eyes. Her brother insisted on being present, but gave them freedom to walk the grounds alone, trusting the Duke's honor. Evelyn's country house was modest compared to the Duke's estates, but it was hers. A small manor with rambling gardens, a library stuffed with books, and windows that overlooked a silver lake. She'd spent the morning in a state of nervous preparation, changing her dress 3 times, arranging flowers, then rearranging them. When the Duke arrived, she led him through the gardens she'd planted herself, showing him the roses she'd coaxed from difficult soil, the herb garden that scented the air with lavender and rosemary. Here, away from society's judgment, she felt like herself again. Confident, capable, alive. "This is beautiful," he said, and she could tell he meant it. "London doesn't suit you, does it?" "No," she admitted. "I go because my brother insists, because society expects it. But this is where I'm happy. In my garden, with my books, where no one is watching me fail to be something I'm not." They walked to the library, where floor-to-ceiling shelves held her treasures, novels and philosophy, poetry and science, everything she collected over 40 years of living. The Duke ran his fingers along the spines, reading titles, occasionally pulling a volume out to examine it. "You've read all of these?" "Some of them twice." She smiled. "You must think me terribly dull." "I think you're the most fascinating woman I've ever met." He replaced the book and turned to face her. "These girls in London, they're taught to be decorative, to say nothing interesting, think nothing complex, want nothing beyond a good marriage. You're real, Evelyn. You're whole. You're yourself." They walked by the lake as the sun began to set, painting the water gold and rose. The Duke stopped at the water's edge, his profile sharp against the fading light. "I've been watching you for longer than you know," he said quietly. "I saw you once 2 years ago at a museum. You were alone, studying a sculpture, and the look on your face, it was pure wonder. You weren't performing for anyone. You were just being. I've thought about that moment ever since." Evelyn's breath caught. "Why didn't you approach me?" "I wasn't ready. I was still playing the game society demands. Dancing with the right girls, saying the right things, being what everyone expected." He turned to her, his gray eyes intense in the twilight. "But I'm done with that now. I want something real. I want you." "I'm not," she started, but he stopped her with a gentle touch to her cheek. "You are not a shadow, Evelyn. You are a lantern. You've been lighting your own way all this time, alone in the dark, not realizing how brilliantly you shine." His thumb brushed her cheekbone. "Let me walk beside you. Let me share your light." She couldn't speak, could barely breathe, but she could nod, and when she did, his smile was like sunrise. The Duke's annual midsummer ball was the event of the season, and this year, everyone knew why. They came to witness the spectacle of the Duke courting the Spinster, to see if the joke would finally reveal itself, if the wager would come due. Evelyn arrived with her brother, wearing a gown of deep emerald silk that made her eyes luminous. She'd allowed herself to hope these past weeks. The Duke had called on her daily, sent flowers and books, written letters that made her heart race. But tonight, walking into his ballroom, doubt crept in like fog. The whispers started immediately. Look at her, dressed like a duchess already. How presumptuous. He'll tire of her by autumn, mark my words. I heard he's already been seen with Lady Charlotte. Much more suitable. That last comment made Evelyn's blood run cold. Lady Charlotte was 19, beautiful, wealthy, and exactly what society expected the Duke to choose. She searched the ballroom for him, but he wasn't there. The dancing had begun and still no Duke. Lady Pembroke appeared at her elbow, false sympathy dripping from every word. Oh, my dear, I'm so sorry. I did try to warn you this was all a passing fancy. Men like the Duke, they have their amusements, but in the end, they always choose appropriately. She gestured across the room to where Lady Charlotte held court, radiant in white silk. She'll make a lovely duchess, don't you think? Evelyn's hands trembled. She'd been such a fool. Of course this was too good to be true. Of course it had all been a game, a summer's diversion for a bored aristocrat. The humiliation crashed over her in waves, and she turned to leave, to flee before she broke down in front of everyone. Lady Evelyn. His voice stopped her at the terrace doors. She turned, and there he was, breathless as if he'd been running, his hair slightly disheveled. Don't leave, please. I have something to show you. He offered his hand, and despite everything, despite her doubts and fears, she took it. He led her through the terrace, past the curious onlookers, down a garden path lit with lanterns. At the end of the path stood something that made her gasp. A glass conservatory, elegant and ethereal in the moonlight, filled with roses. Every variety and color, climbing up the glass walls, perfuming the night air. Through the transparent walls, she could see a small table set for two, candles flickering softly. I had it built for you, he said quietly. I wanted you to have a place here in my home on my grounds, where you could be yourself, where your roses could grow, where you could sit and read and be happy. He turned to her, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen him. I'm sorry I was late. I was making absolutely certain everything was perfect. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Julian, come inside, he whispered. There's more I need to say. The conservatory was warm, filled with the scent of roses and earth and growing things. The Duke led her to the center, where moonlight streamed through the glass ceiling, illuminating them in silver. Then he knelt. Your Grace, she started, but he shook his head. Julian, he corrected gently. My name is Julian, and I'm kneeling before the only woman I've ever truly seen. He took her trembling hands in his. Evelyn, I don't want a decoration for a wife. I don't want a porcelain doll who says nothing interesting and thinks nothing complex. I want a partner, someone who challenges me, who makes me think, who lives fully and deeply and truthfully. He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. Inside lay an antique emerald ring, the stone deep green and luminous, surrounded by tiny diamonds that caught the candlelight. This was my grandmother's, he said. She was fierce and brilliant and completely herself, even when society told her she shouldn't be. She would have loved you. He looked up at her, his gray eyes shining. Marry me, Evelyn. Not because society expects it, not because you're supposed to, but because I love you. I love your mind, your spirit, your courage, everything you are. Marry me and let me spend the rest of my life proving that you were worth waiting for. Evelyn's tears fell freely now, but they were tears of joy, of disbelief, of a happiness so profound it hurt. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Julian, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger, then stood and pulled her into his arms. His kiss was gentle, reverent, full of promise. When they finally parted, both of them were laughing, giddy with joy. "Shall we tell them?" he asked, offering his arm. They walked back to the ballroom together, and the moment they entered, the music stopped. Every eye turned to them, to the way Evelyn's hand rested on his arm, to the emerald glittering on her finger. The Duke's voice carried across the silent room. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor of announcing my engagement to Lady Evelyn Hartley. We will be married before the year is out." The gasps rippled through the crowd like thunder. Lady Pembroke's face went white, then red. Lady Charlotte's mother looked apoplectic. But Evelyn didn't care. She stood beside the man she loved, wearing his ring, and for the first time in 40 years, she felt truly seen. The Duke raised her hand to his lips and kissed it, his eyes never leaving hers. "Let them talk," he murmured. "We have better things to do." Snow fell softly on the morning of Evelyn's wedding, transforming the church into something from a fairy tale. She'd chosen to wear silver rather than white. It felt more honest, more true to who she was. The gown was elegant, simple, and made her feel beautiful in a way she'd never felt before. Her brother walked her down the aisle, his hand steady on her arm. "I'm proud of you," he whispered as they reached the altar. "You deserve this happiness." Julian waited for her at the front of the church, impossibly handsome in his formal attire, his gray eyes bright with emotion. When she reached him, he took her hands in his, and she felt the tremor in his fingers. He was as nervous as she was, as overwhelmed by the enormity of this moment. The ceremony was traditional but felt radical simply because of who they were. The Duke who chose the spinster, the woman who believed she'd never have this. When they spoke their vows, every word rang with certainty. "I, Julian, take you, Evelyn, to be my wife. I promise to honor your mind, cherish your spirit, and love you exactly as you are for all the days of my life. I, Evelyn, take you, Julian, to be my husband. I promise to be your partner, your equal, and your love, for all the days of my life." When the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, Julian cupped her face in his hands and kissed her as if they were the only two people in the world. The church erupted in applause, genuine applause from friends who'd watched this impossible love story unfold. At the wedding breakfast, Lady Pembroke approached, her expression carefully neutral. "I suppose I should congratulate you, Your Grace." The title sounded bitter on her tongue. "You should," Julian said pleasantly, his arm around Evelyn's waist. "My wife is an extraordinary woman. I'm the fortunate one." They left that afternoon for Italy, amid showers of rice and winter roses. As their carriage pulled away, Evelyn looked back at the church, at the gathered crowd, at the life she was leaving behind. "Regrets?" Julian asked, pulling her close. "None," she said, and meant it. The town watched them go, and slowly, grudgingly, understanding dawned. This wasn't a scandal. It wasn't a joke or a wager or a passing fancy. It was real, devastatingly, beautifully real. The Duke had chosen the spinster, and in doing so had chosen love over duty, substance over show, truth over expectation. Some would never forgive them for it. But others, the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the ones who'd also been told they weren't enough, saw it as permission to hope. 1 year later, snow fell on the grounds of Ashford Hall, blanketing the gardens in white. Evelyn walked slowly through the winter landscape, her hand resting on the swell of her belly, Julian beside her with a protective arm around her shoulders. "Careful," he murmured, steadying her on the icy path. "We can go back inside if you're cold." "Not yet." She smiled up at him, her breath clouding in the frigid air. "I love the snow. It makes everything new again." They walked toward the conservatory he'd built for her, now filled with winter roses that somehow still bloomed. Inside it was warm, verdant, alive. They sat together on the bench where he'd proposed, and Evelyn leaned against his shoulder, utterly content. "I have a confession," Julian said quietly. "That day at the museum, the first time I saw you, 2 years before we met at the ball, It wasn't an accident. She looked up at him, surprised. What do you mean? I'd heard about you. About the intelligent spinster who spent her days in libraries and galleries, who cared more about Turner than fashion, who'd rejected 3 proposals because the men were fools. He smiled, self-deprecating. I went to find you, and when I saw you standing in front of that sculpture, completely lost in the beauty of it, I knew. I knew you were the one I'd been waiting for. Then why wait 2 years? I wasn't ready to be worthy of you yet. He turned to face her, his expression serious. I had to become the man you deserved, someone brave enough to defy society, certain enough to choose substance over show. I had to learn to see what mattered. Evelyn's eyes filled with tears. You gave me back my life, Julian. You made me believe I was worth something. No, he said firmly, taking her hand and pressing it to his heart. You already were worth everything. You always have been. I just had the extraordinary privilege of being smart enough to recognize it. They sat together as the snow fell outside, their future blooming inside Evelyn like the roses in the conservatory. Unexpected, resilient, beautiful. Society had called her a spinster, past her prime, pitiful and unwanted. But to him, she was the only woman in the world who was truly alive. And that made all the difference. The end. Dear viewer, what part of this journey touched your heart or surprised you today? If you'd enjoy more historical love stories filled with healing and hope, let me know below. Please like, subscribe, and share to help others find these stories too. Thank you for spending your precious time here. Your next beautiful story is waiting on the screen.